first Gulf War, I'd been to all these briefings with General Schwarzkopf, and they told us about Saddam Hussein and how great a threat he was, and made him sound like another Hitler, and they told about all these elite troops. And then I saw those same elite troops surrendering to CNN camera crews and empty tanks. And I decided then that the threat had been greatly exaggerated. 5 or 6 years later, I was speaking to some group at the Greenbrier, and I picked up one of the newspapers, and I read they had a story about I think the Forgotten War, I think they called it, and they said that we had continued even though everybody felt the first war had ended in just a few weeks' time. That we were dropping bombs over there every 4th day, and that we were spending, I think, $4 million a day or something like that. And then one day they had a front page story in the Washington Post that one of our bombs had gone astray and killed, I think it was 7 little boys who were playing in a soccer in a field in Iraq, and it described just the horrible anguish of this father whose little boy had had his head blown off. And I started wondering about it then, and then when the big Iraq War rolled around in 2002, I started reading all these things, and I remember U.S. News World Report had an article that said, "Why the Rush to War?" And Fortune magazine had an article that said, "We win, what then?" And it said that a war in Iraq a prolonged war in Iraq would make American troops sitting ducks for Islamic terrorists. And so then I was starting to really lean against it. And so then they called me down to the White House and put me in a little secure room.
Talk to you about.
They put me in this little room with Condoleezza Rice and George Tenet, who was the head of the CIA, and John McLaughlin, who was the second in command of the CIA. And I started asking a lot of questions. And the first question I asked was Lawrence Lindsay, the Harvard professor who was the second President Bush's main economics advisor. He had there was a front page story just like a day or two before in which he said a war with Iraq would cost us $200 billion or more. And I asked about that, and Condoleezza Rice said, "Oh no, it wouldn't cost nearly that much." She said maybe 50 or 60 billion, and we'd get some of that back from our allies, which had to be the worst estimate in the history of the world. And then I asked some other questions, like I said, if you can get past the traditional conservative position of being against massive foreign aid, and if you can get past the traditional conservative position of being against huge deficit spending, and if you can get past the traditional conservative position of not wanting the U.S. to be the policeman of the world, and also the traditional conservative position of conservatives being the biggest critics of the UN, we were going to go to war supposedly to enforce UN resolutions. I said, if you get past all those traditional conservative positions, do you have any evidence of any imminent threat? And they didn't. But for 3 or 4 years, it was clearly the most unpopular vote I had ever cast. They told me the night before that vote that one of the TV stations here had run a poll, and it said 74% were in favor of the war, 9% were against, and 17% were undecided. I'll never forget those figures.
Okay.
So when I pushed the button to vote against that war, I wondered, was I ending my political career? I really wondered about that. But much to my surprise, over the years, I turned into a sort of an anti-war Republican.